One of the games announced at the recent Nintendo Direct was Pizza Tower. A bit of a love letter to games of a bygone era, certainly arcade games as well as a few famous console platformers, and it's the first game from developers Tour de Pizza.
Yeah, this one took them 5 years, and quite comfortingly it was made entirely in Game Maker, one of the engines that I've been playing around with.
But is it worth grabbing a Pizza the Action, or is this going to be a jalapeno no? Let's find out.
The narrative centres around Peppino Spaghetti, an Italian chef who is the owner of his own struggling pizzeria, and Pizza Face turns up, clearly a reference to Trollface meme, threatens to destroy his entire business with a giant nuclear laser, which is affixed to the top of a tower, hence the name Pizza Tower, which Peppino is trying to climb to defeat him.
Let's move on to the gameplay now then, and it certainly has a number of different inspirations. We'll start with the obvious. It is a side-scrolling platformer, and it does have a sense of speed as you try to get across levels that's very akin to a Sonic game, but it also has a weight to it, and the character lends himself more to something like Wario in some of the Wario Land games. Aside from this, I do feel like it's almost a single screen arcade game where you're needing to collect X amount of something like Burger Time perhaps, but obviously not in a single screen set across a whole level. And whilst linear, it does have a number of different ways that you can get to the end goal, and we'll explain exactly what that is in a minute, and a few different secret areas that you may find across the way. So the aim of each level is to collect a number of different ingredients that are locked away in cages, and once you get to a certain point of the level, you'll see a huge, almost like thwomp from the Mario games that you have to hit, and that will start a timer that sees you then need to rush back to the beginning of the level and leave through the front door from which you entered. There are a number of different enemies in your way, and you can take hits. It's not like a traditional platformer where being hit will serve as a game over. It does feel like Wario in that respect, as I mentioned a minute ago. But when you have that timer running, whilst you won't get a game over if you run out of time, it will just affect your, say, achievements for that level. If you get hit by a strange swirling pizza that's chasing you after that point, that will result in the level ending and you having to try again.
Yeah, it's nice to have quite a bit of challenge without having any health system. So as Glen says, you don't take damage, you don't die in the traditional sense. And really the choice the player has to make is what they want to collect along the way and what they want to try and leave with within that set time.
Yeah, this is very much about high scores, and that's where that arcade element comes in that there are so many different, almost like sub-ingredients, smaller ingredients that you don't necessarily need, but picking them up will give you more score. And I did mention Sonic earlier, and it very much has that sense of speed as you bomb across levels. You'll need to build momentum and then jump to wall climb. You'll need to smash through blocks. Momentum is definitely a big part of this game, and the quicker that you get on board with that, the easier you'll start to find the levels, not necessarily in difficulty, but just in terms of your overall enjoyment of how they flow.
Yeah, the movement's probably a little more nuanced than shows from the footage. You've got a number of different moves and a number of different techniques that you need to master. Things like moving and then performing a high jump requires a specific button combination, and the timing of which can be quite difficult.
It can be. Some of the controls did feel a bit awkward to begin with. You do start to pick them up, don't get me wrong. But as I mentioned, it is all about that momentum, and at times you'll need to almost go back on yourself, build that momentum, and then turn sharply to have the speed to get up to a certain platform.
Now at the end of defeating a few stages, you'll have to fight against one of the bosses, and this is where things take a little bit of a difficulty spike, and it's certainly a bit of a shock at first.
Yeah, they very much rely on patterns as you would expect, but they do have quite a huge amount of health considering, just take level 1 for example, the first boss. Perhaps you're waiting to be eased in and them have 3 health points or, very traditional bonk 'em on the head. It's not the case at all.
Yeah, during these sequences you will have a more traditional health system related to chef's hats that you can see in the corner, with the enemies shown on the right, but yeah, sometimes they'll be multi-stage and that will respawn its health, sending a shiver down my spine, I have to say.
Yeah, it was pretty brutal to be fair. Within the levels there are also, I did mention hidden areas a moment ago, there are secret levels or secret areas within levels that you can find, and there's also a character with a key, and if you find him and then find the corresponding door, there's a secret ingredient for each stage that you can pick up. And I mentioned achievements earlier. It's not quite an achievement system, but you can look at your progress for each level and see whether you've attained those extra objectives. Another aspect of the gameplay is that at certain points you will pick up other costumes or be given certain items that completely change how the character controls. An early example is becoming like a knight in shining armour, which means that you lose all sense of speed but you are that bit stronger, and you can still build momentum by sliding down slopes and knocking enemies out of the way that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to get past. These change obviously as you go through the game, and I do think again this does a good job of mixing up the gameplay and keeping things fresh.
For a first time game, it is incredibly confident, and I think it does what it wants to very well. Overall for us, I think we're going to give gameplay 19 out of 20, while the controls not quite as high.
Yeah, they do take some getting used to, and there were a couple of moves that weren't quite as easy to pull off, and with a game that relies on momentum, it just knocked things down a tad, but still scored well, 17 out of 20.
When it comes to visuals and performance, we've got a two-sided coin here. On the one hand, performance is 60 frames per second. It's incredibly fluid, in fact, and that ties in with the responsive controls. But on the other hand, we have a visual style perhaps not for everyone.
Yeah, it's incredibly crude in terms of how it's drawn, and I'm assuming that was intentional or it was due to limitations of the software they used. I will say it does have a charm to it, and there were a number of other IPs or just things from the past, pop culture references that I felt the style alluded to. You had things like Earthworm Jim. If anyone remembers, there was a game based on the mascot of Quaver's Crisps called Colin Curley. Very much reminded me of that for some reason. Things like the Ren and Stimpy show from back in the day, it does have all of that kind of thrown into a blender almost. But there were times where I felt the crude nature of the drawing style just went a bit too far. Things like the screen where you complete a level, it just looked a bit too basic for me personally.
Some things it does do well. It has very nice HD rumble, and there's a crunchiness to some of the actions that's quite difficult to articulate, but when you throw an enemy, there's almost like a small screen shake. It just has a tactile feel to it, and that is provided by those slightly janky looking visuals, it has to be said.
Yeah, and that tactile nature, it's very much, as I said earlier, the Wario merged with Sonic is something I never thought I'd see, because they're so different in terms of their gameplay styles for their traditional platformers, but it does work, and it works to a high degree. I was very pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, for me there are some similarities to games like Anton Blast, which we have a demo of on Switch. For me that is just taking things to the next level, you know, it just has that intentional look rather than accidental.
What I will say, and what it does have in abundance, is that quirky nature, which I think works very well for a game like this. I mentioned something like Burger Time earlier, where you obviously had ingredients walking about, and with this having that similar theme, I do think whilst the art style isn't to my personal tastes, it does bring that to life in a way that is appropriate for what's actually happening.
The game has an appropriate soundtrack as well as sound effects. It feels very fitting for that 90s style they're going for. I wouldn't say it's particularly memorable.
No, I don't think every game has to have a memorable soundtrack, but what I will say it must absolutely not have is one that irritates you when you're playing for longer periods, and this doesn't do that at all. It doesn't necessarily stay with you once you've turned it off, but it complements what's happening on screen very well at the time.
Visuals and performance combined then, a difficult one to score because performance is so good, but visuals is a subjective thing. I think this one scores 15 out of 20.
Audio, whilst what I said about not being memorable may sound like a negative, it really isn't, because what it does is exactly what it needs to do, and it's very enjoyable to listen to. It gets 17 out of 20.
As for value, you're looking at £17.99, and you're looking at around about 6 to 10 hours to finish it for the first time, but again, for completionists, there's way more content in there to dig for.
What I will say is I felt the level design was bang on, and it really did do a good job of allowing you to build that momentum well, which made the game so much more enjoyable than it would have been had they got that wrong. And I think that's important to mention in this value section.
Absolutely. It's a classic example of the shackle-free development that can take place when you just make what you want to make. And every stage and floor really does feel unique. A good game, and I think it represents good value. We give it 17 out of 20. So overall, we think Pizza Tower is a very enjoyable time and well worth it if you like this genre. It certainly feels fresh if you like things like Sonic, and is a new twist on the formula.
Yeah, I like the way that it merged together old school single screen arcade with more recent platformers, as well as taking specific styles from some very famous IPs and putting them together in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect to work, but it does just that. And I think it's one of those games that you could come back to over time just to play a level here or there, or you could completely binge depending on how you like to play your games.
Overall then, it gets a SwitchUp score of 85%. Let us know in the comments what you think of this one, and go check it out.
A quick thank you to our patrons and our channel members for your continued support, and to each and every one of you for watching our videos. Take care, and until next time, happy gaming.